Thomas Harper thought he had the perfect family until he found his wife Rebecca in bed with his teenage son Kyle, turning a quiet suburban life into a horrifying scandal no one saw coming. Rebecca Summers was the kind of woman people admired from afar. In her small Ohio community, she was known for her kindness, charm, and the way she seemed to hold her blended family together so effortlessly. People saw her at charity events, school board meetings, and neighborhood cookouts. She always smiled, always spoke gently, and always looked like someone who had everything under control. After marrying Thomas Harper, a successful real estate developer, she moved into his large, well-kept suburban home with her two daughters. Thomas brought his teenage son, Kyle, into the marriage. Together, they looked like a perfect modern family: one mother, one father, and 3 children under the same roof. No one saw anything unusual, at least not in the beginning. Kyle Harper was 17, quiet, and kept mostly to himself. He was finishing high school, played a little soccer, and was known for being polite but distant. He had been through a lot. His biological mother had passed away suddenly when he was just 13, leaving a wound in him that never really healed. When his father remarried 2 years later, Kyle didn't resist the change. He accepted Rebecca with cautious silence, not because he liked her immediately, but because he had learned not to get attached too quickly. He stayed out of her way and she seemed to do the same. Or so it seemed to outsiders. Thomas worked long hours, often traveling between cities to manage properties and developments. Rebecca stayed home, running the household, managing her daughter's schedules, and taking care of everything in his absence. Over time, she took a more active role in Kyle's life too. She started helping him with schoolwork, offering to make his favorite meals, and listening to him talk when he had no one else. At first, Thomas saw this as a good sign. His new wife was trying to bridge the gap with his son, and it made the family feel more connected. But over the months, something in that dynamic shifted. Kyle started skipping school more often. He claimed he was tired or feeling sick. Rebecca would call the school and excuse him, saying she was monitoring him at home. Thomas didn't think much of it, assuming Kyle was simply going through a rough teenage phase. Then came the nights. Thomas would return from late meetings and find the living room empty, the lights off, and Kyle nowhere to be seen. He asked Rebecca about it, and she always had a ready excuse. Kyle was in bed early. Kyle was working on homework. Kyle wasn't feeling well. The pattern repeated too frequently to ignore. Eventually, Thomas noticed Rebecca acting differently. She stopped joining him for breakfast. She stayed up later than usual. She kept her phone close, always flipped face down. When Thomas would try to talk to her about their future or make plans, she seemed distant. The warmth that once defined their relationship was slowly being replaced with something cold and evasive. Still, there was no clear evidence of anything wrong, just an uneasiness that Thomas couldn't explain. One afternoon, Thomas received a call from his security company offering a promotion on upgraded home cameras. On a whim, he agreed and had new surveillance equipment installed throughout the house. Most of the cameras were placed in common areas: the kitchen, hallways, and outside entrances. He told Rebecca it was for protection, considering the recent burglaries reported nearby. She agreed without hesitation. Weeks passed before Thomas thought to check the footage. One evening, while reviewing the files on his laptop, he stumbled across something unusual. It was late at night, well past midnight, and the hallway camera showed Rebecca leaving her bedroom in her robe. She walked down the hallway and entered the guest room, which had been repurposed into Kyle's bedroom after he moved in. She stayed inside for nearly 45 minutes before returning to her room. Thomas watched the footage twice. There was nothing explicit, no proof of wrongdoing, but the image of his wife entering his son's room that late disturbed him deeply. He didn't confront her. Instead, he pretended everything was normal. He kissed her goodbye in the mornings, had dinner with the family, and maintained a calm facade. But inside, suspicion grew like a storm. He reviewed more footage and noticed the same pattern repeated several times. Always at night, always when everyone else was asleep. Still unsure of what he was seeing, Thomas decided to hire a private investigator. It felt extreme, but he needed to know the truth. He couldn't sleep, couldn't focus on work, and every smile from Rebecca felt like a lie. The investigator installed additional hidden cameras in areas Thomas couldn't place them himself: the laundry room, the den, and the staircase landing. He also began watching the house from outside, documenting movements and timestamps. The report Thomas received 10 days later confirmed his worst fears. Rebecca and Kyle were often alone for long periods when he was away. They had stopped acting like stepmother and stepson and started acting like something else, something that crossed every boundary. In some of the footage, Rebecca was seen sitting on Kyle's bed, laughing, touching his shoulder too long, brushing his hair with her fingers. There were no explicit actions on tape yet, but it was more than enough to suggest that their relationship was no longer innocent. Thomas was devastated. The idea of betrayal was one thing, but the idea of his wife having an inappropriate relationship with his teenage son was something he couldn't begin to understand. It wasn't just an affair, it was a collapse of everything he believed about his family, his marriage, and his home. And it wasn't just betrayal. It was criminal. Still, he needed more proof. He needed something undeniable. He told the investigator to keep watching. He wanted to catch them red-handed, if only to put an end to the doubt. For days, he kept up the act. He left for work, smiled at the breakfast table, kissed Rebecca on the cheek, and waved goodbye to Kyle. But each step he took out the front door was calculated. He always came back early. He always checked the camera feeds. And then, one quiet afternoon, he saw exactly what he needed. Rebecca in the living room, sitting on Kyle's lap, her hand on his chest, his arms around her waist. The room was silent except for the sound of the television in the background. They sat there for 10 long minutes, unmoving, unafraid. Then, they stood up, held hands, and walked upstairs. Thomas closed the laptop. His hands trembled. The family he thought he had was gone, and now, he had to decide what to do next. The weight of betrayal pressed on Thomas Harper like a heavy stone. After witnessing the footage of his wife and stepson together, he felt frozen in place, unable to breathe or think clearly. Every scene from the past year flashed before his eyes: Rebecca laughing with Kyle at the dinner table, the long afternoons when Kyle skipped school, the moments Rebecca brushed off his questions. He had missed the signs or had refused to believe them. Now the truth was staring him in the face. But Thomas didn't act immediately. Instead, he kept the footage hidden, both from Rebecca and from the authorities. He needed time. Time to understand what was happening inside his own home. Time to figure out whether his stepson was a willing participant or a manipulated teenager lost in confusion. The shame and rage tangled together inside him, creating a silence that grew more dangerous by the day. He returned to work but became distant and distracted. Coworkers noticed the change, but Thomas made excuses. At home, he avoided looking Rebecca in the eye. He rarely spoke to Kyle. Every movement in the house felt calculated, rehearsed, like everyone was pretending not to notice the tension stretching across the walls. Rebecca, strangely, became warmer toward him. She cooked more elaborate meals, cleaned obsessively, and initiated small talk. But her eyes were different. They avoided his. There was guilt in her posture, and Thomas saw it with painful clarity. He couldn't sleep at night. Instead, he watched the security feeds. He saw Rebecca walking down the hallway in the dark again, slipping into Kyle's room like a ghost. Sometimes she stayed for an hour, sometimes longer. Kyle never stopped her. There was no struggle, no resistance. But Thomas saw how tense the boy looked afterward, sitting on his bed alone, staring at the floor, unmoving. He didn't look proud or defiant. He looked like someone trapped in a situation he didn't know how to escape. Desperate for clarity, Thomas returned to the private investigator with a question he hadn't dared ask before. Could Kyle be a victim? The investigator nodded. He'd seen similar situations. Grooming, manipulation, emotional abuse. It often looked like love to outsiders. But beneath the surface, it was something much darker. The evidence so far was strong, but the investigator advised caution. If the authorities were involved too soon, Rebecca could spin the narrative, blame Kyle, or claim everything was a misunderstanding. So Thomas waited again, but this time with a new purpose. He agreed to install another hidden camera, this one inside Kyle's bedroom. It was a difficult decision, but he felt he had no choice. If Rebecca was violating boundaries and breaking the law, he needed undeniable proof. 2 days later, the camera delivered what he had dreaded. It was late. The house was quiet. Rebecca entered Kyle's room, closing the door softly behind her. She sat on the edge of his bed, whispered something, then pulled him into an embrace. The boy hesitated. He leaned away at first, but she reached for his hand, brought it to her face, and held it there. The scene unfolded slowly, sickeningly. Thomas turned the video off halfway through. It was enough. He had seen everything he needed to see. That night, he didn't sleep. Instead, he packed a small bag and left a letter on the kitchen table. He walked out of the house, unsure of where he was going. He drove for hours until the sky started to turn gray. Rebecca would find the letter when she woke. In it, he told her he knew everything. He didn't scream or curse. He simply stated that their marriage was over, that her actions had destroyed more than just trust, they had destroyed a family. And he warned her that he wasn't going to let it stay hidden. Back at the house, Rebecca read the letter in silence. Her face turned pale, her hands shook, and for a brief moment, she stood completely still, as if calculating her next move. She didn't call Thomas. She didn't go to the police. She didn't leave. Instead, she woke Kyle and told him to pack a bag. They were leaving the house for a few days, heading to a cabin owned by a family friend. She claimed it would be good to get away from everything, to clear their heads. Kyle obeyed, numb and confused. He didn't ask questions. He just followed. They left before noon. Meanwhile, Thomas contacted a lawyer. He wanted to file for divorce, but more importantly, he wanted to report what he had uncovered. With the video footage, the private investigator's report, and his own testimony, Thomas now had enough to build a case. He handed everything over to the authorities. The videos, the timelines, the records of Rebecca's movements. He held nothing back. Child Protective Services became involved almost immediately. Since Rebecca had 2 younger daughters in the home, and Kyle was still under 18, the situation was treated as urgent. Police began their search, but by the time they arrived at the house, Rebecca and Kyle were already gone. For 2 days, no one knew where they were. Rebecca didn't contact friends or family. Kyle's phone was turned off. The police issued a formal alert. Thomas, exhausted and broken, waited by the phone for news. He blamed himself for not acting sooner. He kept wondering how long it had been going on and whether there had been signs from the start. But no amount of guilt could undo what had been done. On the 3rd day, police tracked a vehicle matching Rebecca's car to a gas station security camera near the edge of the state. Inside, Kyle appeared disoriented. He walked ahead of Rebecca with his head down. Investigators suspected she was trying to flee, maybe even leave the country. An Amber Alert was issued, and authorities intensified the search. Finally, the car was found at a remote cabin near the woods. Police approached carefully, not knowing what they'd find inside. What they discovered was unexpected. Rebecca was alone, sitting at the kitchen table, calm and silent. Kyle was found asleep in a bedroom, unharmed but visibly shaken. He didn't resist when officers approached him. He barely spoke. Rebecca didn't try to run. She didn't argue. She simply asked if she could speak to a lawyer. The arrest was swift. Rebecca was charged with multiple crimes, including unlawful sexual conduct with a minor and contributing to the delinquency of a minor. The girls were taken into protective custody, and Kyle was separated from everyone. He didn't cry. He didn't speak. He just sat quietly as officers led him away. The family that once appeared so whole was now shattered beyond recognition. What had started as suspicion had spiraled into something far darker, and the full consequences had only just begun to surface. News of Rebecca Summers' arrest spread quickly, first through the neighborhood, then through local media, and finally across the internet. The headline alone was enough to spark outrage and curiosity. Stepmother arrested for inappropriate relationship with stepson. The quiet Ohio suburb that once admired Rebecca now whispered about her in disgust. Parents pulled their children away when they saw Kyle's name mentioned in connection. The story was no longer private, it had become a public scandal. While Rebecca sat in a county jail cell awaiting her first court hearing, Thomas faced the fallout alone. He moved into a temporary apartment, too ashamed to return to the house that had once been filled with so many hopes. He left everything behind: furniture, clothing, wedding photos, unable to look at any of it. He requested a restraining order and began divorce proceedings immediately. But even those legal steps couldn't erase what had already been done. Kyle was placed in a temporary youth shelter. Although he was close to turning 18, he was still considered a minor under the law. He didn't ask to contact Rebecca. He didn't ask to return to school. He simply sat in silence, day after day. Therapists tried to speak with him, but he rarely responded. He answered questions with short nods or single words. It was clear that beneath the surface, he was carrying the weight of something too heavy to describe. When investigators finally obtained a search warrant for Kyle's belongings left in the house, they uncovered a small journal hidden beneath a floorboard in his bedroom. It was old and worn, the edges curled from months of use. Inside were dozens of pages filled with Kyle's handwriting, fragments of thoughts, scattered emotions, and most importantly, a timeline of how his relationship with Rebecca had developed. The journal revealed things that hadn't been captured on camera. It told of how Rebecca had started treating him differently months before anyone noticed. She complimented him constantly, made him feel special, and subtly alienated him from his friends and teachers. At first, it seemed harmless motherly attention, kindness, reassurance. But it grew more intense. She began confiding in him about her problems with Thomas, telling Kyle that he was the only one who truly understood her. Then the journal took a darker turn. Kyle described how Rebecca encouraged him to skip school and spend time alone with her, how she would sit too close, touch his hand too long, or lean in while whispering things that confused and excited him. He wrote about feeling scared but also flattered. He was still grieving his real mother, still unsure of who he was becoming. Rebecca exploited that. She blurred the lines between comfort and control, love and manipulation. The most disturbing entries describe the first time she crossed the line. Kyle didn't write about it in graphic detail, but he did say he felt ashamed afterward. He wrote about not wanting it to happen again but not knowing how to say no. He described the guilt, the fear of losing his father, and the confusion of being pulled deeper into something that didn't feel right but also didn't feel entirely wrong because Rebecca convinced him it was love. This journal became a key piece of evidence in the case. Prosecutors now had proof that Kyle had been groomed. It wasn't a relationship. It was abuse disguised as affection. The story the public thought they knew took on a more tragic tone. This wasn't just a scandal, it was a deeply disturbing example of psychological manipulation. Despite this, some people still blamed Kyle. Online forums and news comment sections were filled with opinions. Some called him weak. Others accused him of being a willing participant. It became clear that society wasn't ready to fully understand the complexity of such cases, especially when the victim was a teenage boy and the abuser was a woman who looked like the model of motherhood. The narrative didn't fit traditional expectations, and that made it harder for people to see Kyle as a victim. Meanwhile, Rebecca remained calm and collected in court. During her initial hearing, she pled not guilty. Her lawyers claimed the relationship had been misunderstood, exaggerated by a jealous husband trying to punish her during a messy divorce. They painted Kyle as a troubled teenager who had a history of lying and emotional instability. They tried to suppress the journal as inadmissible, but the judge ruled it could be used. Thomas, sitting in the courtroom, stared at the woman he once trusted with his son's life. He didn't speak. He didn't blink. He simply watched as her defense tried to erase the truth with well-crafted arguments and legal maneuvers. The silence between them was louder than any words. As the case gained more attention, national news outlets picked it up. Talk shows discussed the psychological dynamics of grooming, and experts debated whether Rebecca could be classified as a predator. Advocacy groups began using Kyle's story as an example of why male victims of abuse often go unheard. Despite the growing awareness, Kyle stayed hidden from the spotlight. He refused all interviews. His only request was to be transferred to live with a maternal aunt out of state, someone he remembered from his childhood, someone unconnected to the trauma. Permission was granted, and Kyle left Ohio quietly. No one knew exactly where he went. His school records were sealed. His name faded from the headlines, but the damage didn't disappear. The wounds Rebecca left behind weren't just emotional, they were psychological and permanent. As Rebecca awaited trial, new information continued to emerge. Financial records showed that she had taken money from Kyle's college fund, money set aside by Thomas before they married. She had used it to pay for spa treatments, hotel stays, and shopping trips. It seemed the betrayal went beyond just emotional abuse. She had drained resources, manipulated people, and built an illusion that kept everyone blind until it was too late. Each new revelation added to the portrait of a woman who had lived behind a mask. To the world, Rebecca had been a devoted mother and wife, but inside her own home, she had created a world where boundaries didn't exist, where truth was something she could bend to fit her desires. And in that world, Kyle became the greatest casualty. The trial date was set for 3 months later. Prosecutors promised to bring everything forward: videos, journal entries, witness statements, psychological evaluations. Rebecca's attorneys promised a defense just as aggressive. The courtroom would become the final battleground for truth, and the verdict would determine whether justice could finally be served. The courtroom filled with a quiet tension as Rebecca Summers was brought in wearing a gray prison uniform, her hands shackled loosely in front of her. She no longer resembled the polished woman the community had once admired. Her hair was tied back carelessly, her eyes sunken from sleepless nights, and her face expressionless. On the other side of the room, Thomas Harper sat silently beside his attorney, his jaw clenched, eyes fixed straight ahead. The trial was about to begin, and the truth, ugly and raw, was about to be laid bare for everyone to hear. The prosecution began with a clear and deliberate tone. They didn't sensationalize the case. Instead, they let the evidence speak. The jury saw the home surveillance footage first. Rebecca entering Kyle's room late at night, staying for long stretches, her frequent visits during school hours, the way they interacted more like a couple than family. The prosecutor paused between clips, explaining the timeline, connecting the moments, highlighting the grooming behaviors. The room remained painfully silent. The jurors watched without blinking. Next came the journal. A trained child psychologist was brought in to explain its contents to the jury. The expert testified that the entries showed classic signs of grooming and coercion. Kyle had been emotionally isolated, confused, and manipulated by someone he trusted. The entries were read aloud, Kyle writing about how he didn't know whether to feel special or sick, how he was afraid of telling his father, how Rebecca made him feel like he was the only one who truly mattered to her. The courtroom shifted uncomfortably as each page was described. There was no denying that what happened in that house was not a relationship, it was abuse. The defense countered with a calculated strategy. They tried to frame Kyle as emotionally unstable, suggesting he had a history of behavioral issues and had misinterpreted affection for something else. They claimed Thomas had a vendetta against Rebecca and manipulated the narrative to punish her during the divorce. They argued that the videos didn't show anything illegal, and the journal could have been exaggerated or even fabricated. But then Kyle was called to testify. The judge ordered a closed courtroom to protect his identity and mental well-being. Only the attorneys, the jury, and essential personnel remained. Kyle walked in slowly, wearing a suit too big for his thin frame, his eyes fixed on the floor. When he took the stand, he didn't look at Rebecca. He barely looked at the jury. His voice was quiet and shaky as he began answering questions. He told them how things started, how Rebecca first treated him like a son, then like a best friend, then like something else. He explained how he didn't understand what was happening at first, how he felt important, needed, but then things escalated, and he didn't know how to stop them. He told the jury that every time he wanted to say no, she found a way to pull him back, and through guilt, through fear, through her ability to make him feel like he would ruin everything if he spoke up. He broke down briefly when describing the night Thomas caught them. He said it was the only moment he felt both relief and shame. Relief that it might finally end, shame that it had gone on for so long. His testimony lasted nearly 2 hours. By the end of it, some jurors had tears in their eyes. Even the judge looked visibly affected. Kyle left the room without saying another word. The next few days were filled with more testimony, Thomas's quiet but powerful statements about the change he saw in his wife, about how he found the footage and how he struggled with whether to go to the police or handle it privately. Friends and neighbors testified too, some describing Rebecca as warm and generous, others admitting they had sensed something strange but had chosen not to question it. A teacher from Kyle's school admitted he had grown concerned when Kyle suddenly stopped participating in class and became withdrawn, but didn't feel he had enough reason to intervene. Rebecca never took the stand. Her attorneys advised against it. Throughout the trial, she remained stone-faced, never reacting to the evidence, never showing remorse. When the prosecution delivered their final statement, they reminded the jury that Rebecca was not just a woman who made a mistake, she was someone who used her authority, her position, and her emotional influence to exploit a vulnerable child. They asked the jury to see past the surface and deliver justice. The defense argued that there was no physical evidence of abuse, no medical report, no eyewitnesses to an explicit act. They claimed the entire case rested on interpretation of a journal, of footage, of behaviors that could be explained differently. But their arguments felt empty compared to what the jury had already seen and heard. The jury deliberated for less than a day. When they returned, the courtroom was packed. The judge called for order as the jury foreperson stood. One by one, the charges were read aloud, and the verdicts followed. Guilty, guilty, guilty. Rebecca Summers was found guilty on all counts: unlawful sexual conduct with a minor, endangering the welfare of a child, and psychological coercion. The judge wasted no time. In a sentencing hearing held shortly after, Rebecca was given 15 years in prison without the possibility of parole. She showed no emotion as the sentence was read. No apology, no tears, nothing. Thomas exhaled, the first full breath he had taken in weeks. Kyle, sitting beside a court-appointed therapist, didn't react. His face was calm but unreadable. The storm had ended, but the damage remained. After the trial, Rebecca was transferred to a state correctional facility. Her name was added to the registry of convicted offenders. She was no longer the woman who hosted fundraisers or volunteered at church. She was now a convicted criminal whose actions had destroyed a family. Kyle was placed in long-term therapy. He declined all media requests and eventually changed his last name. He enrolled in a new school out of state, hoping to disappear into the background and rebuild his life in silence. His trust in people was broken, his view of love distorted, but he tried every day to find some piece of normal again. Thomas sold the house. He moved away quietly, choosing to live somewhere he could walk the streets without seeing reminders of what had happened. He never remarried, never spoke about Rebecca again. For him, the trial had closed a chapter he hoped to forget, but the scars would never fully heal. The story faded from headlines. Other scandals came and went. But in one house in Ohio, behind well-kept hedges and a red brick facade, a horrifying secret had once lived. And for those who had survived it, the echoes would remain long after the cameras and reporters were gone. Months passed, but the memories of what had happened refused to fade. Though the trial had ended and justice had been served in the eyes of the court, the real damage lingered quietly behind the scenes. The family was not just broken, it was erased. Every part of the life Thomas Harper had built with Rebecca Summers had been reduced to evidence, court transcripts, and therapy appointments. What remained were only questions and the lingering sting of betrayal. Rebecca was now deep into her prison sentence. She kept to herself in the correctional facility, rarely speaking to others. Some inmates targeted her out of disgust once they discovered why she was there. Others avoided her completely. She was no longer seen as a mother, a wife, or a respected member of society. She was just another offender, stripped of any identity except the crimes she had committed. Even behind bars, she maintained a kind of quiet arrogance. She rarely acknowledged her guilt and refused any counseling offered to her. Back outside, Thomas tried to build something resembling a normal life. He changed jobs, not because he had to, but because he couldn't sit in the same office where he used to brag about family vacations or show off pictures of his blended family. He avoided conversations about his personal life and stayed away from anything remotely connected to his past. He kept to himself, working long hours, returning to an empty apartment, and avoiding social invitations. Trust had been destroyed in him, not just in others, but in his own judgment. He had missed the signs, ignored his instincts, and paid the price. For Kyle, the healing process was even more complex. Now living with his aunt in another state, he began attending therapy regularly. The sessions were slow at first. He barely spoke during the first few appointments, unsure how to express the confusion and shame that clung to every thought. Over time, the words came. He talked about how Rebecca blurred the lines between love and control, how she filled the space left by his biological mother only to use it for something twisted. He admitted he had once thought he loved her, not realizing that what he felt wasn't love at all, it was dependency, created by manipulation and emotional grooming. Kyle started writing again. Not a journal like before, but personal essays, stories, pieces that explored grief, loss, and control. His therapist encouraged him to keep going, to put everything on paper as a way to separate himself from the trauma. In school, he remained quiet but focused. He avoided crowds and friendships, preferring silence over attention. Slowly, his grades improved. Teachers noticed he was thoughtful, even brilliant in how he expressed emotions in writing. But no one knew his past. His records were sealed, and his identity protected. Despite all this, Kyle's nights were restless. He woke up sweating from dreams he couldn't explain, often reliving moments he thought were gone. Sometimes he saw Rebecca's face in his sleep, not as the woman who sat at the dinner table, but as the one who stepped into his room and whispered things that made him feel small and trapped. He hated her, but some part of him still felt tangled in her web. That was the part he hated most. Meanwhile, the younger daughters Rebecca left behind were also affected. Child Protective Services had placed them with extended relatives, and their names were kept out of the media. But they weren't shielded completely. At school, other kids whispered. Their friends' parents grew distant. Some classmates repeated words they had heard adults say: disgusting, unfit, twisted. The girls didn't understand everything that had happened, only that their lives had changed overnight and their mother wasn't coming home. Thomas tried to keep in touch with them at first, writing letters, sending gifts, hoping to preserve some connection to what had once been their shared life. But over time, the communication dwindled. The relatives caring for them decided it was better to cut off all reminders of the past. It was a decision Thomas didn't fight. He understood. Everyone was trying to move on in their own way. Public interest in the case eventually died down, but not entirely. Every few months, someone online would rediscover the story and reshare the court details, the headlines, the video clips. Forums would light up with debates, some blaming Rebecca entirely, others speculating on how something so twisted could stay hidden for so long. The world seemed fascinated with the idea of evil hiding in plain sight, especially when the villain wore a familiar face. A true crime documentary company even reached out to Thomas, offering to pay for exclusive interviews and access to unused evidence. He declined. So did Kyle. They didn't want to relive the past for entertainment. For them, it wasn't a story, it was a wound that was still healing, one layer at a time. One afternoon, nearly a year after the trial ended, Kyle visited a lake near his aunt's house. He brought a small notebook and sat on a bench, staring out at the still water. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel overwhelmed. He didn't feel watched. He didn't feel like a victim. He just felt quiet. He opened his notebook and began writing, not about Rebecca, not about Thomas, but about the future. He wrote about strength, about what it meant to survive, and how healing wasn't about forgetting, but learning to live with the weight without letting it crush you. Somewhere deep in Ohio, the house where it all happened stood empty. The new owners had no idea what had taken place within those walls. They repainted the rooms, remodeled the kitchen, and planted flowers in the backyard. But the house would always carry a history that couldn't be seen, only felt by those who had lived it. Rebecca remained behind bars, serving her time, her name now tied permanently to a scandal that turned a family into strangers. She rarely received visitors. Her letters to Kyle, sent through her lawyer, were never opened. They were returned, one by one. There were no reunions, no apologies, no last words, just silence. And sometimes silence was the only thing left after the storm.